The perfect beginning. Angela and Mark's life together seemed almost storybook-like. They met in college, at a friend's dinner party, where Angela's sharp wit and Mark's quiet confidence drew them to each other in an instant. Both were from different worlds, yet their hearts aligned. Angela was a freelance journalist with an insatiable curiosity about people and their stories. Mark worked as an architect, practical and steady, the grounding presence in Angela's sometimes chaotic life. Their love was the kind people around them admired and aspired to have, a love built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a deep understanding that transcended words. After 6 years of dating, they celebrated their third wedding anniversary, feeling as if they were still newlyweds, caught in the thrill of each other's presence. Their friends would often comment on how lucky they were, and Mark would just smile, nodding in agreement. He felt blessed every day to have Angela by his side. Their connection was genuine and intense, and when Angela announced her pregnancy, their friends and family celebrated with them. The couple dove into preparations with enthusiasm, decorating a nursery, picking out names, and dreaming about the future with their new baby. They had everything in place for what they hoped would be a perfect life as a family. As the months went by, Mark and Angela fell deeper into their roles as expectant parents. Angela's friends threw her a beautiful baby shower, complete with pink and blue balloons, since they decided to keep the baby's gender a surprise. Mark built a crib from scratch, wanting to give his child something special he had made himself. They spent countless evenings sitting in the nursery, imagining what their child would look like, who they would take after, and all the family moments they'd cherish in the years to come. There was laughter and love, and it felt like nothing could shatter the happiness they shared. But life has a way of slipping in the unexpected, even in the most well-constructed plans. The day finally arrived when Angela went into labor. Mark held her hand as they rushed to the hospital, nervous but filled with anticipation. Hours later, their baby was born, a beautiful girl with a small tuft of dark curls and a pair of the most alert eyes the nurses had ever seen. But in the moments following her birth, a heavy silence filled the room as the nurse handed Angela the baby. Angela's heart swelled with love as she looked at her newborn daughter, but her joy was shattered when she saw the expression on Mark's face. He stood frozen, eyes wide with shock, and something darker that Angela couldn't quite identify. His face had drained of color, his mouth slightly open as he stared at the baby in Angela's arms. In the quiet of the room, Angela heard him whisper under his breath, "This can't be my child." Without another word, Mark stormed out of the hospital room, leaving Angela bewildered and alone. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the nurses, who glanced at each other with sympathetic but uncomfortable expressions. She wanted to call after him, to tell him to come back and hold their baby, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. It was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of their lives, and yet here she was, clutching her newborn daughter with a feeling of profound loneliness. That night, Mark didn't return to the hospital. Angela held her daughter close, whispering comforting words to her as if the baby, barely a few hours old, could somehow understand. She couldn't wrap her mind around what had just happened. How could the man she loved, the man who had stood by her through thick and thin, simply walk away at a moment like this? She replayed their last moments before the baby was born, searching for any sign that this might happen, but there was nothing. Just joy, anticipation, and love. Then, around midnight, her phone buzzed with a message. Angela grabbed it, hoping against hope it was Mark saying he was coming back, apologizing for the shock that had gotten the best of him. Instead, her heart sank as she read his words. "How could you betray me like this? I thought I knew you." Her hand shook as she tried to call him, but each time, it went straight to voicemail. She typed out message after message, trying to explain that she had never been unfaithful to him, that she didn't understand what he was talking about. But every message she sent received no response, and the painful realization began to sink in that her husband thought she had lied to him. Friends and family began to reach out, some gently asking what had happened, others sending quiet sympathies, assuming the worst. The whispers spread like wildfire, and soon Angela felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm, alone and vulnerable. Desperate to clear her name, Angela decided to take matters into her own hands. She would prove her loyalty and her innocence to Mark, no matter the cost. She ordered a DNA test the very next morning, determined to show him that their daughter was indeed his, hoping it might salvage the remnants of their shattered relationship. Mark reluctantly agreed to the test, though he refused to meet her in person or even speak to her. Every interaction felt cold, distant, and laced with suspicion. In the weeks that followed, Angela sank into an agonizing waiting period. She returned home to an empty house, with the nursery standing silent and unused, a painful reminder of the joy that once filled their lives. Each time she walked past it, she felt a mixture of sadness and anger well up inside her. She tried to focus on taking care of her daughter, pouring all her love and energy into the tiny, innocent life she held. Yet every day was haunted by Mark's absence, and every night was filled with the echo of his accusing words. Finally, 2 weeks later, the DNA test results arrived. With shaking hands, Angela opened the envelope, her heart pounding. She needed this truth to redeem her, to bring Mark back, to restore the life they had so carefully built together. As she read the results, her breath caught. The test confirmed that Mark was indeed the biological father of their daughter. Angela felt an immense relief flood her, a vindication that finally lifted the weight she'd been carrying. But there was more. Alongside the results was a note explaining that Mark's genetic profile showed traces of African ancestry. Angela's mind raced, piecing together the implications. She remembered Mark mentioning once, in passing, that his family history was primarily European. This revelation was as shocking to her as it would be to Mark. She could already imagine his reaction, torn between disbelief and confusion. Later that evening, Angela sat down to write Mark a message, attaching the DNA results and explaining everything. She held nothing back, describing the toll his accusations had taken on her, the isolation she felt, and the pain of their family falling apart. Hours later, she received a reply, a curt acknowledgement of the results, and a suggestion they should both talk to a geneticist for clarification. Though hurt by his aloofness, Angela clung to the sliver of hope that the truth would heal their wounds. Uncovering the past. Mark was silent as he studied the DNA report, trying to process what it meant. His mind wrestled with conflicting emotions, relief that Angela hadn't betrayed him, and a gnawing confusion about his own identity. This revelation of African ancestry, something he had never suspected, rattled him to his core. As he sat in his small, rented apartment, he was forced to confront a part of his heritage that he'd never been told about, one that had been hidden in layers of family secrecy. Mark agreed to meet Angela and a geneticist the following week to discuss the results. Their meeting was tense, each of them carrying the heavy scars of the past few weeks. Angela looked different to him, visibly worn and tired, her usually bright eyes clouded with hurt. For the first time, he saw the toll his actions had taken on her, and a flicker of guilt tugged at him. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but the weight of his shame held him back. Dr. Lewis, the geneticist, greeted them warmly as they sat down in his office. He quickly reviewed the DNA test results with them, pointing out the sections that indicated Mark's African ancestry. Dr. Lewis explained that this trait might not have surfaced in recent generations, especially if certain family members had married within specific groups to keep the bloodline pure, a practice more common in earlier times. "It's fascinating," Dr. Lewis said, leaning forward. "Your DNA markers suggest a blend of both African and European heritage, which would mean that some of your ancestors likely had African roots that have simply been hidden or unacknowledged." Mark was stunned. "But my family, they've always identified as white. This just doesn't make sense. We've never even mentioned this possibility. My parents were very strict about our heritage." Angela listened, her heart aching as she watched Mark struggle. She saw how this discovery was reshaping his understanding of his own identity, and for the first time, she felt compassion replacing her anger. His reaction wasn't just about her or the baby. It was about the very foundation of who he believed he was. She reached over, gently resting her hand on his. He looked at her, his eyes softened, and for the first time since their daughter's birth, there was a glimmer of connection. As they left the geneticist's office, Angela suggested they talk to Mark's parents to learn more about his family's past. He nodded, though the thought of confronting his parents with this discovery filled him with dread. His parents had always been strict, reserved people, especially his father. Conversations in their household rarely went deeper than pleasantries and practical matters. But Angela's quiet persistence nudged him forward, and the following weekend, they made the drive to his childhood home. Mark's mother, Alice, welcomed them with a stiff embrace. She avoided eye contact with Angela, her tension palpable. She seemed to sense that this was no ordinary visit. Mark's father, Harold, was seated in his favorite armchair, reading the newspaper, and only glanced up briefly before returning to his reading. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Mark cleared his throat and began. "Mom, Dad, Angela, and I discovered something about my ancestry. Something unexpected." He started, his voice hesitant. "The DNA test showed that I have African roots." Alice and Harold exchanged a look. Alice's face paled, while Harold's jaw tightened. Silence settled over the room, pressing down on them like a heavy weight. Finally, Alice spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I had hoped this would never come to light," she said, looking down at her hands. "Your great-grandfather. He had a life none of us knew about until recently, and we were told to keep it buried. We were told to never speak of it, for the sake of our family's reputation." Angela and Mark exchanged bewildered glances, urging her to continue. Alice took a deep breath, visibly struggling with her emotions. "Your great-grandfather was a complicated man. He was married to your great-grandmother, and they had children, our family line. But he also had another family, one that he kept hidden from society. His other children were of mixed race. We don't know much, only that they were kept at a distance, far away, as if they never existed. We were told it was for the best, to avoid scandal." Mark's stomach churned. He felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted, exposing roots he'd never seen before. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "So you're saying that our family erased part of its history, part of our bloodline?" His voice trembled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Harold set down his newspaper, finally looking his son in the eye. "It was a different time, Mark," he said, his tone hard. "People didn't think the way they do now. Your great-grandfather did what he thought was best to protect the family's name. It wasn't a choice made out of malice. It was a decision made out of necessity." Angela couldn't stay silent. "But that decision has hurt so many people, including your own son and granddaughter. Hiding that part of your history doesn't erase it. It only causes more pain." Her words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Alice looked down, her expression conflicted, while Harold's face hardened. He was not a man accustomed to questioning the past, but Angela's words had struck a chord. Mark could feel the anger boiling inside him. "I spent weeks thinking Angela had betrayed me because of the assumptions I made. Do you realize the damage this secret has caused? To our family, to my marriage, to my understanding of who I am." His voice was louder now, filled with hurt and frustration. Alice reached out, tears glistening in her eyes. "Mark, I'm so sorry. We only wanted to protect you, to give you a life free of the complexities we thought this knowledge would bring. But we were wrong. I see that now. I wish we had handled things differently." Harold looked away, his jaw set, the lines on his face deeper than Mark had ever noticed. But Mark didn't push him further. He could see that his father was wrestling with emotions he'd buried long ago, and that was enough for now. After a tense silence, Alice excused herself and returned with a worn leather-bound box. She opened it, revealing a collection of letters, photographs, and old documents. Some were so yellowed and fragile they looked as if they'd crumble at the slightest touch. Alice handed them to Mark and Angela, explaining that they were remnants of the past that had been kept in the attic for years, hidden away from curious eyes. Mark and Angela spent the next hour sifting through the box. The letters revealed fragments of a forgotten story, correspondence between Mark's great-grandfather and a woman named Lillian, who was evidently his second partner. The letters were heartfelt, filled with words of love, promises, and regret. It was clear that their relationship had been meaningful, a bond that could have lasted if not for the oppressive weight of society's expectations. There were photographs, too, grainy black and white images of Lillian and her children. Angela looked closely at the faces, feeling a strange sense of connection to these people she had never met. In one picture, Lillian stood beside a boy with a striking resemblance to Mark. She held him close, her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders, her eyes a mixture of pride and sorrow. Angela felt her heart ache for them, for the life they had been denied, for the love that had been stolen from them by secrecy and prejudice. Mark's hands shook as he held the photograph. He could see the resemblance between himself and this long-lost relative, and he felt an inexplicable kinship with the boy in the picture, a boy who had been erased from their family's history. It was a painful reminder of the invisible threads that bound them all together, whether they acknowledged them or not. By the end of the evening, Mark and Angela left his parents' home with the box, determined to uncover more of his family's hidden legacy. As they drove home in silence, each lost in thought, Mark reached over and took Angela's hand. It was a small gesture, but it held a world of unspoken apologies and promises. For the first time in weeks, Angela felt a spark of hope. This journey was far from over, but they were taking the first steps together, facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Piecing together a forgotten legacy. Back in their own home, Mark and Angela carefully unpacked the box of secrets that Alice had given them. The weight of the truth settled heavily around them as they examined the brittle pages, faded photos, and fragmented letters. Mark, normally so composed and confident, seemed unsettled, struggling to process that his life, his heritage, held a story he'd never been told. Angela, on the other hand, was methodical, organizing the letters in chronological order and laying out photographs side by side, creating a timeline that might help them understand the lives that had been hidden for so long. The letters revealed a love story between Mark's great-grandfather, James, and a woman named Lillian who, from the context of their correspondence, was of mixed race. The relationship appeared both intense and tragic, their words filled with passion and deep longing, but shadowed by the realities of a society that wouldn't accept them. Each letter was a window into the soul of a man Mark realized he didn't know at all. This wasn't the stoic, disciplined ancestor his family had painted him to be. This was a man who had loved fiercely, even if it meant defying societal norms and family expectations. Angela took the lead, her instincts as a journalist kicking in. She felt the need to tell their story, not just for Mark and their daughter, but for Lillian and her children, who had been left in the shadows. As she read aloud, Mark sat beside her, listening, absorbing each word as if trying to connect with a distant part of himself that had been obscured by generations of silence. The letters were filled with tenderness and regret, hinting at the sacrifices James had made to ensure his first family's stability and social standing, yet he had also expressed an undeniable love for Lillian and their children. Each letter held unspoken promises, moments of joy, and heartbreaking farewells, as if both knew they couldn't escape the constraints of their world. One letter stood out. It was marked with a date in the early 1920s and was written just days before James had supposedly cut off all contact with Lillian. In the letter, James apologized to her, explaining that he had been pressured by his family to sever ties for the sake of preserving their reputation. His words were filled with sorrow, regret, and a sense of duty. He wrote about a difficult decision he had to make, to keep the family business intact and avoid scandal. Angela could feel his heartbreak in the trembling lines, and she noticed that even his normally elegant handwriting appeared shaky and hurried. Angela's voice softened as she read the last part of the letter. "Lillian, my dearest, know that I have never loved anyone as I love you. I am bound by chains I cannot break, chains of duty and expectation. But know this, no matter what they demand of me, you and our children will always be in my heart. One day, I hope our descendants find a way to live freely, without these cruel restrictions. Until then, know that my love for you endures beyond these forced silences." Tears filled Angela's eyes, and even Mark, who had struggled with this newfound heritage, felt a deep pang of empathy for a man he'd once thought of only as a distant ancestor, a name on the family tree. He realized that James had been forced to choose, not out of malice but out of the rigid social rules of his time. He was a man divided by love and obligation, unable to reconcile his heart with the world around him. As Mark looked at the photograph of James, his features softened, as if he could finally forgive the man for the choices he had made. The following morning, Angela and Mark decided to go to the local historical society, hoping to find more about James's life and Lillian's mysterious story. They arrived at a small building tucked away on a quiet street, filled with shelves of old newspapers, dusty archives, and framed photos of people long forgotten. An elderly librarian named Mrs. Thompson greeted them, her eyes lighting up with interest when they explained their search. She was delighted by their curiosity, as few people in town took much interest in the local archives. Mrs. Thompson led them to a section that held records from the early 1900s. Back then, many records were sparse, she explained. But you'd be surprised how many personal stories are hidden in these archives. People often underestimate the importance of letters, photographs, and even newspaper clippings. They hold memories that history books tend to overlook. Angela and Mark spent hours combing through the records. They uncovered newspaper articles that mentioned James's involvement in local politics and business affairs, but there was no mention of Lillian or his other family. However, in an old yellowing newspaper from 1923, they found a brief article that spoke volumes. It was a simple announcement of the opening of a new school for underprivileged children, funded anonymously. Angela felt a chill as she read the description of the benefactor's goals: to provide educational opportunities for children of all backgrounds and origins. Angela and Mark exchanged a glance, both suspecting that James might have been this anonymous benefactor. It was likely his way of giving back to a community that wouldn't have accepted his children if they knew the truth. It was a small gesture, but it spoke to his values, to a quiet rebellion against a society that had demanded he abandon his second family. Their search also led them to records of Lillian's family. They learned that Lillian had moved to a nearby town after James severed ties, raising her children alone. They found fragments of her life scattered through various records: a job at a local diner, mentions of her children attending a small, segregated school, and even a photograph of her taken at a community event. As Angela held the fragile photo, she felt a strange connection to the woman in it, a connection that transcended time and lineage. This was a woman who had loved, lost, and persevered. As they left the Historical Society, Mark felt an unexpected urge to reach out to Lillian's descendants, if any were still around. He wanted to understand more about their lives, to acknowledge the history that had been so callously erased. Angela agreed wholeheartedly, and together, they embarked on a mission to trace Lillian's lineage. They contacted genealogists and searched online ancestry databases, tracing threads that eventually led them to a living descendant, a woman named Evelyn, Lillian's granddaughter. Angela reached out, explaining their connection and their desire to learn more. Evelyn was initially wary, reluctant to discuss a family history that had been filled with shadows and unanswered questions. But as Angela shared the details of their discoveries, the letters, the photographs, the school funded by James, Evelyn began to open up. They arranged to meet at a cafe halfway between their towns. The meeting was a surreal experience for Mark. Evelyn was in her late 70s, with warm eyes and a gentle demeanor. She had heard stories about Lillian, though much of her family's history had been lost or deliberately buried. Evelyn's father, one of James and Lillian's children, had rarely spoken of his lineage, burdened by the sense of being an outsider in his own family's story. Evelyn shared that her father had always felt torn, aware of his heritage, but never fully accepted by either side. As they talked, Mark could see the similarities between himself and Evelyn. Two people trying to reconcile a fragmented past, bound by family secrets they hadn't asked to inherit. Evelyn revealed that her family had struggled financially, and she had grown up hearing whispers of an inheritance that had been stolen, a legacy that had been kept from them. Mark's heart sank. He realized that his family had hidden more than just history. They had hidden wealth and opportunity, the very things that could have changed the lives of Lillian's descendants. The sacrifices James had intended to make for his hidden family had been lost, tangled in a web of secrecy and greed. The inheritance meant for Lillian's family had somehow vanished, leaving them in poverty while his official family prospered. Evelyn's stories stirred something deep within Mark. He realized that his initial reaction to his daughter's birth, his anger, his distrust, his refusal to believe Angela, was a mirror of the same prejudices that had haunted his family for generations. He had judged Angela and their child based on appearances, just as his ancestors had judged Lillian and her children. The realization hit him hard, and he struggled to hold back tears. Before they parted, Evelyn handed them an old, tattered notebook that had belonged to her father. It contained poems, sketches, and a few passages describing his life, his longing to be accepted, and his memories of Lillian. Evelyn had kept it, hoping that one day it might provide answers about her heritage. She placed it gently in Mark's hands, a tangible piece of the history that had been hidden from him. Back at home that evening, Mark and Angela sat together, reading the notebook. They felt a sense of unity, not just with each other, but with the generations that had come before. They knew there was a long road ahead, a journey to reconnect with the descendants of James and Lillian, to bridge the gap that had divided their family for so long. It was a journey that would require honesty, courage, and forgiveness, and for the first time, Mark felt ready to embrace it. Their daughter, now peacefully asleep in her crib, represented more than just their love. She was the embodiment of a legacy that refused to be silenced, a testament to resilience, love, and the power of connection across generations. Mark looked at Angela, his heart filled with gratitude for her strength, for her willingness to stand by him, and for her determination to uncover the truth. They had taken the first steps toward healing the fractures of their family's past, and together they would make sure their daughter grew up knowing the fullness of her heritage. They knew that there were still difficult conversations to be had, secrets yet to be uncovered, and wounds that would take time to heal. But in that moment, with the weight of the notebook in Mark's hands and the gentle rise and fall of their daughter's breathing in the background, they felt a profound sense of peace. The journey of reconciling the past had just begun, but they were ready to walk it together, honoring both sides of their family and the love that had endured through generations of silence. The family tree and a hidden inheritance. As Mark and Angela delved deeper into their family's history, the complexities of their ancestry began to reveal not only emotional truths, but also a peculiar puzzle surrounding the hidden inheritance. Evelyn's words about her father's suspicion of a lost legacy weighed heavily on them, and Angela couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The following weeks saw them researching old legal documents, property records, and family papers, seeking any clue that could shed light on James's intentions and the fate of the fortune he had meant to pass down. Mark felt increasingly driven by a sense of duty, not just to Lillian's family, but also to his daughter, who he now saw as the first member of this generation to carry both lines. He wanted to ensure that his daughter grew up knowing her heritage, not divided but whole, with an understanding of both the sacrifices and the mistakes that had shaped their family's story. One evening, while Mark was reviewing the faded documents Evelyn had given them, Angela received a letter from an unexpected source. Daniel, a distant cousin they had never met but who had heard about their inquiries. Daniel was an amateur historian fascinated by their great-grandfather's life. He mentioned that he had come across documents related to James's business dealings and political connections, and he suggested that they meet to discuss his findings. Intrigued, Mark and Angela arranged to meet him the following week. When they arrived at the old, cozy coffee shop where Daniel had suggested they meet, they were surprised by his resemblance to Mark. He was older, in his 60s, with graying hair and a scholarly air about him, yet there was a familiar warmth in his eyes. Daniel greeted them with a firm handshake and a twinkle of curiosity. He was excited, as if he had been waiting for someone else in the family to care about this hidden history. Once they sat down, Daniel wasted no time. He pulled out a folder brimming with documents, yellowed with age, and began explaining how he had stumbled upon the truth about James's involvement in the community and the inheritance he had tried to leave for Lillian's family. "Your great-grandfather was a remarkable man, Mark," Daniel began, glancing between him and Angela. "He wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who cared deeply about social issues, particularly education and equality. In his day, of course, he couldn't be open about it without risking everything, especially his business and social standing. But he found ways to help underprivileged communities discreetly." Angela leaned forward, fascinated. "So he tried to make a difference, even if it was from behind the scenes?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, exactly. I found records indicating that he donated large sums of money anonymously to fund schools and charities aimed at helping Black communities. But here's the twist. He didn't just fund them out of goodwill. Part of the reason he did it was because he intended for that money to reach his own children, the family he had with Lillian. He hoped to secure a legacy for them, even if it was done indirectly." Mark's face tightened as he processed this revelation. But if he had intended that money for his second family, why did they grow up with so little? Why didn't they inherit anything? Daniel sighed, looking somber. "That's where things get complicated. James's official family, our side of the family, caught wind of his intentions after his death. His will contained a provision that hinted at another beneficiary, but his children, your grandfather included, contested it. They wanted to keep the inheritance within the family, the legitimate family as they saw it. The inheritance was never divided the way James had intended. Instead, it was held back, wrapped up in legal battles that ultimately stripped Lillian's descendants of what should have been theirs." Angela felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over her. So they knew. They knew about Lillian's family and still chose to withhold their rightful share. Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, and they justified it by saying they were protecting the family's reputation, maintaining the purity of their lineage. But really, it was just greed. That money could have changed Lillian's children's lives. Instead, they were forced to struggle, all because of pride and prejudice." Mark sat back, his mind swirling with guilt and frustration. He had spent his entire life believing in the version of his family that had been presented to him. A line of successful, respectable people who had always done right by their name. Now he understood that the legacy he'd been raised to uphold was tainted by hypocrisy and selfishness. "So," Mark asked, struggling to keep his voice steady, "is there anything left? I mean, is there any way to recover what they were supposed to inherit?" Daniel hesitated, then pulled out a final document, a legal paper marked with faded signatures. "This is the last will James wrote before he died. I found it in an archive, buried among other records from that time. It outlines his wishes for Lillian's children and mentions an inheritance, though the details are vague. However, there's something interesting. He mentions a trust fund, one he established specifically for his descendants from both families." Angela's eyes widened. "So it still exists?" Daniel shrugged. "It's hard to say. Trust funds like this are often siphoned off over time, especially if they're unclaimed. But if the fund wasn't accessed, or if it was mismanaged, there might be legal grounds to restore it. The only way to know for sure would be to consult a financial expert and an attorney who specializes in trust law." Mark felt a glimmer of hope mingling with his anger. "I want to do it. I want to see if there's any way to claim what's rightfully theirs." Angela squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with encouragement. She saw the fire in him, a determination that she had come to admire over the years. Mark wasn't just doing this for Lillian's family. He was doing it for himself, to make peace with a past that had cast such a dark shadow over his life. Reconnecting the lost branch. As the weeks turned into months, Mark and Angela became fully immersed in the task of bringing together the divided branches of their family. It wasn't just about reclaiming the inheritance or understanding their ancestors' choices. It was about forging relationships, bridging gaps, and reuniting kin who had lived with invisible barriers for generations. Angela, in her role as both investigator and documentarian, began recording interviews with Evelyn and other descendants from Lillian's side of the family. She wanted to capture their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for what this reconciliation might mean. The more she learned, the more she realized how deeply Lillian's descendants had felt the absence of a clear heritage. Some of them had grown up with only whispers and shadows of who they were, stories woven from fragments, bits of old letters, and rumors that never fully explained the sense of loss they carried. One evening, while Angela was transcribing an interview, she came across an old letter that had been tucked away in a separate envelope, one she hadn't noticed before. It was from Lillian herself, written in the shaky but graceful handwriting of a woman determined to record her memories for future generations. Angela's breath caught as she read Lillian's words, penned in the last years of her life, a letter filled with love and quiet sorrow. "My dearest children and grandchildren," the letter began, "I write to you with the hope that one day you will find a family that loves and cherishes you as deeply as I have. Our lives have been filled with hardships and moments of despair, but know that you come from a lineage of strength and courage. Your father, though taken from us by forces we could not control, was a good man, a loving man. He gave what he could from the shadows, though I know it was never enough. My hope is that one day our children will be recognized, that our history will be honored, and that you will live with the pride of knowing who you are." Angela shared the letter with Mark, and together they spent the night talking about Lillian, imagining what her life must have been like, raising her children alone yet instilling in them a sense of dignity and resilience. Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose reading her words. He was determined to ensure that her wishes, unfulfilled in her lifetime, would be honored now. With Evelyn's help, Angela and Mark organized a large family reunion, inviting both sides of the family, old and new, to come together for a weekend of connection and reconciliation. They rented a beautiful estate near the town where Lillian had once lived, a place with sprawling gardens, old oak trees, and a large hall that could accommodate everyone. Invitations were sent, family trees were drawn up, and Angela made sure each family member would receive a booklet she'd created, one that included old photographs, letters, and the family history she had pieced together. As the reunion approached, Angela felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She knew that not everyone would be ready to embrace this new family structure. The older generations from Mark's side might feel uncomfortable with the revelations, while Lillian's descendants might carry understandable resentment. But Angela believed in the power of truth, and she held on to the hope that by acknowledging the past openly, they could start to mend the wounds that had festered in silence for so long. On the day of the reunion, Angela and Mark arrived early to set everything up. The main hall was decorated with photos from both sides of the family, arranged chronologically to show the merging of their histories. Angela had also set up a legacy table in one corner, displaying copies of James's and Lillian's letters, along with other artifacts from their lives. She wanted everyone to feel the weight of the history they were now part of, to see the faces and read the words of those who had come before them. Guests began to trickle in slowly at first, an older couple from Lillian's line, a few cousins from Mark's side, and gradually more and more family members arrived, filling the room with a palpable sense of anticipation. Mark's parents, Alice and Harold, had been initially hesitant about attending, especially since they were still grappling with the uncomfortable truths they'd learned about their own parents. But in the end, they chose to be there, recognizing that their presence would mean something to Mark. Evelyn arrived with her children and grandchildren, her face a mixture of joy and nervousness. She approached Mark and Angela with tears in her eyes, hugging them both tightly. "You have no idea what this means to us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "To finally be seen, to finally be a part of this family. It's something we've wanted for so long." Throughout the afternoon, family members mingled, exploring the exhibits Angela had prepared and introducing themselves to cousins, aunts, and uncles they'd never known existed. Conversations bloomed, some hesitant, others enthusiastic, as people began sharing their own experiences and memories. For the first time, there was laughter and connection where before there had only been silence. During the reunion, Mark took to the stage, nervous but resolute, to address the gathering. He looked out over the room, seeing faces that reflected both familiar traits and distant resemblances, faces that were, in many ways, parts of himself. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This reunion represents more than just a gathering of relatives. It's a step toward acknowledging a history that has long been hidden, a story that deserves to be told. I know that for many of us, learning about our ancestors, about James and Lillian, has been challenging. But it's also been a chance for us to reclaim something precious, a legacy of love, courage, and connection that was lost, but is now being restored." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. "I want to personally apologize to each of you. My side of the family has lived with privilege, while others have lived with unanswered questions and hardships. And for too long, those truths were ignored. But today, we are here to change that. We are here to honor both sides, to accept each other as one family, and to move forward with a commitment to understanding and respect." As he spoke, Mark could see his words resonating with people in the room. Some nodded, others wiped away tears. Evelyn, sitting near the front, smiled, her pride unmistakable. After his speech, Angela joined him on stage, holding their daughter, who was now wide-eyed and curious, taking in the unfamiliar faces around her. "Our daughter represents a new chapter in this story," Angela said, her voice gentle but strong. "She carries the legacy of both families, of James and Lillian, of everyone here today. And we want her to grow up knowing who she is, to be proud of the people who came before her. That's why we're all here today, to give her, and future generations, the gift of truth, love, and unity." As they left the stage, applause filled the room, and Angela felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She and Mark had taken a painful history and transformed it into a celebration of resilience and connection. They watched as family members continued to interact, some sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity, while others delved into the family booklets, eager to learn more. One of the most touching moments of the reunion came when Alice, Mark's mother, approached Evelyn with an apology. Her face was a mixture of humility and sorrow, the weight of her own family's choices evident in her expression. "I can't undo the mistakes of the past," Alice said, her voice shaking. "But I want you to know that I am truly sorry for the pain my side of the family caused yours. I want to be part of this healing, to help rebuild what was lost." Evelyn took Alice's hands, her own eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Alice. That means more than you know. This healing, it's what we've all needed. We may be family by blood, but today we're choosing to be family by heart as well." The reunion stretched into the evening, with family members sharing stories, photographs, and memories. Angela took photographs throughout the event, capturing moments of laughter, hugs, and heartfelt conversations. She knew these images would be precious reminders for future generations, a testament to the power of connection and reconciliation. As night fell, the remaining family members gathered under the stars, surrounding a small fire pit in the estate's garden. They shared stories of James and Lillian, stories of resilience and love that spanned generations. Some sang old family songs, while others shared poems and memories. The air was thick with emotion, a mixture of sadness for what had been lost and joy for what had been reclaimed. At the end of the night, Evelyn held Angela's daughter, cradling her gently, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. She looked at the child with a soft, reverent smile, whispering words of love and blessings that she had wished to say to her own grandchildren years before. "This little one," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper, "she carries the hopes of both families. She's a reminder that love can bridge any divide, that truth can heal any wound." Angela felt her heart swell with gratitude and peace as she watched Evelyn pass her daughter back to her. In that moment, she knew that they had succeeded in honoring Lillian and James's memory, in restoring a legacy that had been lost to time and prejudice. As she held her daughter close, Angela looked around at the gathered family, at the faces filled with hope and forgiveness, and she knew that this once broken family was finally whole. In the months that followed, Angela completed a documentary capturing their journey, a labor of love dedicated to her daughter and to the memory of those who had come before them. It was a story of resilience, of healing, and of the enduring strength of family. And as they continued their lives, Mark, Angela, and their daughter carried forward the legacy of James and Lillian, a legacy no longer hidden but proudly embraced. A legacy embraced. The documentary Angela created became more than just a family heirloom. It was a powerful story that resonated deeply with everyone who watched it. Angela had titled it The Hidden Roots, a legacy of love and resilience. It was an intimate portrait of family, courage, and reconciliation, weaving together fragments of the past with the vibrant connections of the present. The documentary included interviews, letters, photographs, and moments from the reunion that captured the raw beauty of family bonds, fractured but finally mending. Each time Angela revisited the footage, she felt as though she were honoring not just James and Lillian, but everyone in the family who had suffered in silence, yearning for a sense of belonging. As Angela and Mark shared the documentary with their extended family, word began to spread, and soon it reached people beyond their immediate circle. Mark's parents, Alice and Harold, had initially been hesitant to let the story go public, worried about how it might reflect on their family. But after seeing the impact of the reunion and the joy it brought to both sides, they grew to appreciate Angela's work. They understood that this story, once buried, could become a source of healing for others facing similar struggles with hidden histories and fractured family connections. One day, Angela received a call from a local museum director who had heard about the documentary. The director, fascinated by the story and its historical significance, wanted to showcase the documentary as part of an exhibition on local history and social justice. The exhibit would explore the unspoken stories of families who, due to the prejudices of their time, had been forced to hide or erase parts of their heritage. Angela was thrilled by the opportunity, seeing it as a chance to give voice not only to her own family's journey, but to countless others who had been silenced by history. The museum exhibition opened a few months later, with The Hidden Roots as its centerpiece. Angela and Mark attended the opening night, along with Evelyn, Alice, and many members from both sides of the family. The exhibit was a moving tribute to the untold stories of families across generations, with each display highlighting struggles for equality, love-defying social barriers, and the courage of those who chose to embrace all parts of themselves despite societal pressures. As they walked through the exhibit, Angela noticed visitors pausing to watch her documentary, their faces reflecting emotions ranging from sadness to empathy to inspiration. Seeing strangers connect with her family's story gave her a profound sense of accomplishment and pride. It was as if the generations of her family, once divided, were finally being honored in a way that reached far beyond their own experience. Their story had become a testament to the power of truth and reconciliation, a beacon of hope for others seeking to reconcile with hidden parts of their own lives. After the museum exhibit, Angela received numerous messages from people who had been touched by her family's story. Some shared their own experiences of rediscovering lost branches of their families, while others thank her for shedding light on the complex, often painful journey of heritage and identity. Among the messages was one from a university professor who specialized in African American studies and genealogy. He invited Angela and Mark to speak to his students, seeing their story as an invaluable lesson on the impact of intergenerational trauma and the ways families could heal by embracing their true history. The lecture turned into one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. In front of a packed classroom, Angela and Mark spoke about the pain and confusion of uncovering hidden truths, about the initial shock, anger, and guilt, and finally, the relief that came with embracing every part of their family. Evelyn joined them as well, sharing her perspective as a descendant of the forgotten branch. Her gentle voice filled the room as she spoke about Lillian's resilience, her love, and her hope that someday her family would be whole again. One student raised his hand, asking how they had managed to forgive the wrongs committed by their own relatives. It was a question Angela had asked herself many times, one she had grappled with during sleepless nights. It wasn't easy, she admitted, but I think forgiveness started with understanding. We didn't excuse their actions, but we tried to see the world from their perspective. They made mistakes, driven by fear and prejudice. But those mistakes didn't have to define us. We had the choice to change the legacy, to make different choices, and to build a future rooted in love and acceptance. That's what ultimately led us to forgiveness. Mark added, "For me, it was about realizing that the past is something we can learn from, not something we have to repeat. I grew up with certain beliefs and prejudices without even realizing it, but this journey forced me to confront those beliefs. And in doing so, I realized I could be a better father, a better husband, and a better person." After the lecture, students lined up to speak with them, thanking them for sharing their story, some even tearfully confiding in Angela about their own struggles with family secrets and identity. Angela left the university that day feeling profoundly moved, her heart full with the knowledge that her family's story had inspired others to face their own histories with courage. Back at home, Mark and Angela's life settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by a deeper understanding of who they were and the journey they'd been on. They continued to maintain close relationships with both sides of the family, frequently visiting Evelyn and hosting family gatherings where new traditions began to form. Their daughter, now a toddler with Mark's quiet curiosity and Angela's warmth, was at the center of these gatherings, cherished by her extended family as a symbol of hope and healing. One autumn evening, as the family gathered for a dinner at Angela and Mark's home, Evelyn presented Angela with a gift, an intricately hand-carved wooden box. Inside was a collection of Lillian's personal mementos, small tokens, photographs, and a locket with a faded portrait of James and Lillian together. Evelyn had kept these precious items as a reminder of her grandmother's love and resilience, and now she was entrusting them to Angela, believing she would carry Lillian's legacy forward. Angela held the locket, her heart swelling with emotion. She could feel the weight of Lillian's dreams, the legacy of love she had passed down through her family, despite the barriers and pain she'd faced. Holding it close, Angela promised herself that she would protect Lillian's memory, honoring her story with each generation that followed. As the evening wound down, Mark stood to make a toast. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each family member, new and old, his voice steady and full of warmth. "To family," he said, raising his glass. "To the ones who came before us and paved the way, even in the darkest of times. To the sacrifices and choices that shaped us, and to the future we're building together. May we carry this legacy with love, courage, and unity." A chorus of "to family" filled the room, and Angela felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, fraught with moments of doubt and pain, but it had brought them to this moment, together, as one family, complete and unbroken. In the months that followed, Angela's documentary reached an even wider audience. It was picked up by a streaming platform, and soon it found viewers across the country, people from all walks of life who saw echoes of their own stories in the tale of James, Lillian, and their descendants. The documentary sparked conversations about family, identity, and heritage, encouraging others to confront their own histories and to bridge gaps that had divided them from their loved ones. Angela and Mark continued to share their experiences, speaking at schools, community centers, and family events. They became advocates for open dialogue about heritage and reconciliation, helping others navigate the difficult path of uncovering and accepting hidden family stories. Their journey had transformed them, and now they were using that transformation to help others heal. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to understand, Angela and Mark sat her down and shared with her the story of their family. They showed her the documentary, carefully explaining each part of the journey, the pain, and the healing. She listened with wide-eyed wonder, clutching Lillian's locket, her small fingers tracing the faded portrait inside. As she grew older, their daughter carried forward the legacy of both James and Lillian, embracing her heritage with pride and an open heart. She became the bridge between past and future, embodying the unity and resilience that had defined her family's journey. For Angela and Mark, their story was no longer just a family secret. It had become a testament to the strength of truth, the power of reconciliation, and the enduring legacy of love that could withstand even the most profound separations. In the end, they had transformed a hidden, fractured past into a beacon of hope for future generations, ensuring that their daughter, and those who would come after her, would always know where they came from and carry their family's legacy with pride and love.